I hope that you've had a good couple of days so far. I know that you've been here, many of you, since Wednesday, and I've been looking at your program over the last few days, and you've clearly been covering a huge range of subjects. You also seem to be able to draw the celebrities in, not just David himself, of course, but Stephen, who I'm sorry I missed yesterday, and I think Gareth Malone, who is going to follow me later on today. Politicians, of course, hate having to compete with true celebrities because we get completely eclipsed. And I discovered this the other night, on Monday, when we had a big education conference in London, in Lancaster House, with educationalists from across the country, and the Secretary of State was there, Kevin Brennan, the Labour Schools Minister, and I was there. And we all turned up and we were chatting away with lots of head teachers at the beginning, before the opening speeches. And suddenly there was a great sort of to-do at the back of the hall. And in wandered the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, ruffling his hair. And suddenly all the people who were so interested in talking to us disappeared and sort of rushed over to get his autograph and everything. We were all sort of left there talking to ourselves. We were just beginning to feel quite neglected when a young female teacher from, I think, Devon came over to me and sort of patted me on the shoulder and said, "Are you David Laws, the schools minister?" And I said, "Yes, I am," feeling extremely flattered that she knew who I was. And then she flattered me even more. She said, "Any chance of a photograph?" And I said, "Of course." And she said, "Well, here's my camera. Will you take one of me and Boris?" Which was rather put me in my place. But I did. Anyway, I really am delighted to be here today. I wanted to be here to thank many of you, including LACA, for the fantastic work that you're doing to put in place the preparations to make the Universal Infant Free School Meal policy a success later on this year, in just a few weeks' time. And I want to talk about those preparations, and I want to give you an update on the progress to date. I also wanted to try to explain for those who are uncertain about some of our motivations behind this, and I think most of you in the hall will know the background to this, but not all of you. I wanted to explain a little bit about our motivations for funding this very ambitious policy at a time when there is austerity in the public finances and in which most areas we're having to retrench. And I also wanted to set the developments of this year in a historic context and talk a little bit about where we've been in the history of school food and where we're going. Because I was just a couple of weeks ago reading a research report into school food in the north east of England. And there was a study of about 40 children from 2 schools that had been provided with state-funded breakfast and lunch. And the study reported on how those meals improved the health of the pupils and improved their attainment. And you might think that this was a recent study, 2010 or 2007, before Ed Balls did the pilot schemes. But actually it was around 100 years ago, way back at the beginning of the last century, when the beginnings of the revolution in school food actually begin to take place. And it was actually back in the mid-19th century when charities such as the Destitute Children's Dinner Society raised money to provide meals for poor children. Manchester provided meals for its poor and badly nourished children from 1879. And a similar scheme ran in Bradford, where the local school board argued that if the state were to take charge of educating pupils during the day, then it should also discharge its responsibility to feed those children while they were in school. But these pioneers were actually taking quite a big risk, because incredibly they were actually breaking the law in those days by providing a free meal, and they could have been stopped from doing so. But they understood that without a healthy meal, children wouldn't be able to concentrate in school and they wouldn't be able to realize their potential. And pupils, once these meals appeared in the schools in the early days, were not slow to realize their potential and to take them up. One of the first dinner ladies I've discovered, a Miss Cuff, reported back at the end of the 19th century that while on day 1 of free school meals in her school, 13 of the children declined her tempting offer of oatmeal porridge. The next day, this had dropped to just 2, and from the third day onwards, everybody was taking up the cuisine that she was serving. And at first, the arguments that there should be a national provision of meals in school most definitely fell on deaf ears. To the Westminster establishment, the idea seemed much too radical, too expensive, too difficult, questionable in ideological terms. And then as now, there were people who found excuses, every excuse under the sun, to resist change. And it was only really after the experiences in the Boer War in South Africa in 1899 and into the early part of the 20th century when we began to see young people coming into our armed forces and understand the problems of undernourishment, the problems of unhealthy young people from households across the country, that there began to be a national movement to have school meals in all schools. And in 1906, under a Liberal government, I should point out, we saw the passing of the 1906 Education, in brackets, Provision of Meals Act, although I should admit, in the interests of cross-party cooperation, that it was a Labour MP who initially put his name to that bill, which then became an act. And this gave local authorities the green light to spend public money on school food and, crucially, money from the Treasury. And these trailblazers back in 1906 really lit a torch which would be taken up by many other people across the country, politicians, caterers, people in schools, right through Jamie Oliver and the school food plan, right through to the developments that we see today. And the take-up, as you know, of school meals, both free and paid, increased dramatically in the Second World War. It often is conflicts and the national pulling together that comes from conflicts that cause a big transformation in attitudes to things in areas such as healthy eating. And before the Second World War, there were just 3% of young people eating school meals. By the conclusion of the Second World War, there were about 30% of young people taking up that offer. And come 1946, the day of our now much-loved dinner lady dawned, as the popularity of school meals had grown so much that paid assistance were needed in many schools across the country. And in June 1949, the number of school dinners reached nearly 3 million, which was over half of the school population. And that number went on climbing in terms of the participation of young people in school meals until it reached the high watermark in the mid-1970s, when around 70% of young people in school ate school meals. But since that peak in the 1970s, the number of children, as you know, who have been receiving school meals has been in a steady decline. And in the 1980s, the then Conservative government cut back both on the entitlement to free school meals, but also removed some of the standards that were designed to ensure that school meals were healthy. And the take-up of meals and the quality of much of the food then started to decline, indeed went into a steep decline, with the take-up of school meals dropping from something like 7 in 10 children in the mid-1970s to the recent figure, which is much closer to 4 in 10 children, higher in primary schools, as you'll know, and lower in secondary. And that's been bad for attainment in schools, bad for children's concentration, it's been bad for the health of young people. It's undermined the socialization that comes from sitting down for what in some households is the only meal of the day, where young people are sitting at a table and using a knife and fork. And the removal of free meals has also been an extra big pressure on family budgets. As we heard earlier on, it is not easy to feed a family every day, particularly if you've got a number of children in it, and particularly if your household income is low. And free meals can be worth something like £1,500 a year for a family with 3 children. Free school meals are sometimes regarded, I think, as an aspiration and an idea from the left in politics. But many of us, and this is certainly my view, regard this policy as a common sense policy for the mainstream majority of people in the country. And I happen to have that old-fashioned view that I referred to earlier in my speech, that given these children are the responsibility of the school, are the responsibility of the state for 7 or 8 hours during the day, the least thing that we can do in discharging our responsibility of care is actually give them healthy food when they are with us at school, and that is what we are now trying to do. Many of our minds are now on September, yours and most certainly mine, and most certainly our officials in the Department for Education, when this new entitlement to universal free school meals comes in every school in England, and also, as we've heard, over the border in Scotland. And the policy is the latest milestone in the long history of school meals, and it's also one of the most important. It's in fact the biggest expansion in free school meals in 65 years, where 1.5 million young people, additional young people, will become entitled to free meals. Now, every step forward in the last 100 years has had its critics, but remember that the work that we are doing together has a proud and long-standing heritage, and we are part of a progressive movement that has been transforming the quality of school food for over 100 years. And it should come as no surprise to us that there is a very strong public feeling about school meals. Whether we enjoyed them or not when we were at school, they are a nostalgic part of life in our country. And every single parent wants their child to be able to eat healthily. The nutritional quality of school meals has rightly been at the centre of recent debate. The demand for healthier, more nutritious school meals has come from parents, from schools, from school cooks themselves, from caterers, from academics, and of course from the celebrity chefs. Successive governments have responded by working with schools and caterers to improve the standards of school meals. But it is the work that all of you do which is now really turning these great aspirations into a reality. The quality of school meals has continued, I think, over the last few years to improve, thanks to the hard work of many people in this room, and school cooks, and parents, and nutritionists, and many dedicated teachers and head teachers across the country. And we can, I think, now look back on the day when the famous turkey Twizzlers were an unfortunate blip on a proud history of school meals in this country. But it was clear to me when I became schools minister that there was a lot more to do if we were to build on the successes and the progress that there has been over the last 5 or 6 years. And that's why the coalition government commissioned John Vincent and Henry Dimbleby to undertake an independent review of school food, to look at how school food was being provided across the country. And I'm hugely grateful to the work that John and Henry have done, assisted very ably by Miles, who's been with us in this conference, and by all of those people, including some in this hall, who contributed to the review. And the review confirmed that many schools now do a brilliant job of producing healthy, tasty school meals and promoting the value of healthy eating. But the review also, as you know, found that there is still work to be done. There is still too much food with low nutritional value, there is too low take-up of school meals, and there are too many young people eating unhealthy packed lunches. And mistakenly, many parents think that the packed lunch that they're serving their young people with, that they're taking into school, is actually a healthy option. In fact, the evidence that the School Food Review highlighted is that fewer than 1% of packed lunches actually meet the school food standards, which is part of the challenge that we have to meet. So almost exactly 1 year ago to this day, the results of the school food plan, which were published and by John and by Henry, were available. And I think at your conference last year, John Vincent came to this very stage to tell you what he and Henry had concluded and what the government was committing to doing next. And the plan contained both actions for government and for the school food sector. Like John and Henry, once we knew what needed to be done, we wanted to get straight on with improving the quality of meals and going through all of the solutions that they were recommending to take up those recommendations. And those of you who are here yesterday will have heard Miles talk about the fantastic achievements in this last year. For example, the new cooking and nutrition curriculum is being introduced for pupils up to the age of 14 and becomes statutory at the start of next term. New training materials are being released which focus on school food in the head teacher training curriculum. There's work with Magic Breakfast to set up self-sufficient breakfast clubs in schools, and significant work is beginning to increase the take-up of good school food beyond the Universal Infant Free School offer itself. And importantly, we've also developed clearer, easier to implement school food standards, which, as you know, we published around a month ago on the 17th of June, alongside practical, down-to-earth guidance for schools and caterers. And you'll know that these new regulations come in January next year. Now, the plan also recommended that the government should offer free school meals for all children in primary schools. It was indeed the most ambitious part of the plan by quite a long way. And however enthusiastic and determined Henry and John were, they might have thought that that was going to be a big ambition and one that would take a while to develop. Of course, it wasn't entirely a new thought within government, because the previous government had actually established some pilots in both Durham and Newham and in other parts of the country to test the proposition of free school meals and to see what their impact would be. And the results from that were very, very clear. Good, healthy school food combined with universal provision had a positive effect on all pupils, but particularly on those from the most disadvantaged backgrounds. And universal provision increased take-up amongst the disadvantaged who are eligible for meals, but who don't always take them up. They actually removed the stigma of being a free school meals kid. And they meant that the 1 in 4 children from working families, but who nevertheless live in poverty, would be entitled to a meal for the very first time. And when I visited a school recently in South London, I was genuinely moved to hear from one of the teachers there an account of her discussion with a parent, a working parent, who previously had not had her children entitled to free school meals, who was confirming with the school that they would be for the very first time from September, and who was pretty close to tears at the thought that she would at last have a serious pressure from her household budget removed with 2 or 3 children who would be eligible. And there are a lot of people in the media, particularly in London, who have this weird view of society that it consists either of very poor people on benefits who ought perhaps begrudgingly to be entitled to free school meals, and then what they sometimes often refer to as the middle class, which for them tends to mean people like them, who they assume are all earning £100,000 plus. And the real world is not, as most of us know, like that. The real world consists of many people who are in work, but who are not by any means wealthy or rich, and who don't feel they have a lot of disposable income. The people on 15,000, on 20,000, on 25,000. And as this teacher said to me about this young lady, parent who came to see her, if you're living in London and you've got 3 children, and if you're earning 18 grand a year, you really don't feel as if you're affluent, you really don't feel as if you've got much disposable income. And this policy really makes a big difference to you, and it's going to make a big difference to family budgets, particularly in these very pressing times. And those people who are terribly worried that we're going to be feeding those families that don't need help can have one bit of reassurance, which is that we're not supplying free school meals to the 7% of young people who go to the private sector, so they don't need to worry that young people who don't need free school meals in Eton, Westminster and Rugby will be getting them. They won't be getting them under this policy. Now, the pilots also showed that when universal free school meals were implemented, children were less likely to eat crisps and unhealthy packed lunches during the school day, and they were more likely to eat healthy food instead. And crucially, there was a positive impact, a material positive impact on children's levels of literacy and numeracy. And crucially, as I mentioned earlier, what the pilots showed, because there were different pilots in different parts of the country, was that to achieve the benefits of this offer, it has to be a universal offer. It doesn't work if you just increase it a little bit up the income scale. The pilots in which entitlement was only extended modestly to low-income working families didn't see the attainment and other benefits which we want to secure. So this is a universal entitlement, which we're introducing not just because we want to be popular with parents, though politicians always do, but also because the only way that we can secure the benefits of this policy is to make it a universal offer. And sometimes there are reasons, as Nick Clegg said in his comments earlier on that we saw, there are reasons to deliver things in a universal way, particularly when young people eating healthily in school is something that we universally want. We don't want that offer to be available just for some young people. Now, there are some who are against this policy as a point of principle. They don't think it's the job of government to make sure all children get a healthy lunch. Like those who blocked the first moves to provide healthy meals to school children 100 years ago, they argue that it's too expensive, too radical, too difficult. We in government don't share that position, and we can't allow a small number of siren voices to undermine a policy which will save parents money and improve the education and health of young people in this country. Left to their own devices, those who want to undermine this policy would actually end up taking us back in time. They'd unwind over 100 years of progress, and they'd probably even undermine the progress that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of food quality. And the government has no intention of allowing that to happen. And that's why it's so important that we work together to make this policy not just get over the line, but be a stunning success when it's introduced in September. Because if we get this right, and it is a success, I don't believe that anyone in any party is going to take this policy away in the future. It'll be so popular with parents and in schools that it will be a very brave politician who dares to take it away. And that is the prize that we're aiming for this September. Now, I don't underestimate in any way the challenges that this poses for some schools, and many of those will have been passed on to you, and I'm extremely grateful to LACA and the Children's Food Trust for the work that they've done in the support service, which has been absolutely brilliant, and where we've referred schools that have been struggling and had great feedback from them about how proactive that service has been. And I am determined and confident that we can work together to overcome the problems that there are in some schools. And in the pilot areas, the schools, the catering providers and local authorities demonstrated that it is possible to deliver this policy of good quality hot meals in schools in the timescale that we have allowed between the announcement last September and the delivery this September. For some schools, the transition is going to be quite an easy one, particularly in parts of the country where the school meal service was retained. But we do understand that in other areas, it's going to be more difficult. Every infant and primary school should by now have a plan in place to deliver universal free school meals for all their infant pupils in September. And that's 16,300 schools across England alone that are in the process of putting that policy in place. And as a government, we're providing the necessary financial support, £1 billion of revenue funding over the first 2 years, 150 million of capital funding to support improved kitchens, and £22.5 million of funding that Miles and John and Henry recommended that we should put in the small schools to make sure that we give them extra help with their costs. Some very good advice that the people behind the school food plan gave us, which I think has been genuinely helpful to smaller schools. And I'm going to keep the availability of that small schools funding for future years under review to establish whether we need any continuation in the future. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, we're funding a support service run by school food experts, including many of you in this room, LACA and your partner organisation, the Children's Food Trust. And that support service is doing a brilliant job in supporting schools and caterers to find local solutions to their own individual problems. And I really am enormously grateful to every single person who has contributed to that. Carrie-Anne, to your team and to Linda and her team and all of the advisors out in the country who are doing such good work. And it's a huge reassurance to me when I get the odd grumpy letter from head teachers that I can refer them to your support service and know actually that it's going to be a really proactive operation that's going to go out there and fix the problem. And I don't share the pessimistic view of some that head teachers don't have the ability or determination to deliver on this bold and ambitious policy. Head teachers are passionate about it, and in my experience, they are getting on with the job. And through local authorities and the support service, we've been tracking in the DFE with our officials, and I'd also like to pay tribute to our officials in the DfE who have been working incredibly hard on this and have done a fantastic job and have given me excellent policy advice on every single issue that's come up over the last year. They have been tracking the progress of schools towards meeting this very important commitment. And what I can announce today for the first time is that based upon the evidence that we've had from local authorities, from individual schools, and from your support service, over 99% of schools now have a plan in place to deliver universal free school meals in September, and that is a fantastic achievement, which I really am grateful to you for. That means that well over 16,000 of those schools that I mentioned earlier are already on track to deliver. We're aware of fewer than 100 schools which still need further work to devise a delivery strategy, and the department and the support service are now working through school by school, literally school by school, to offer support and to ensure that every single school in England is on track to deliver at the start of the school term in September. And all of this is a tribute to the phenomenal efforts of the people in this room, to head teachers, to school catering teams, to local authorities, to school governors, and to individual staff in schools throughout the country. Of course, this doesn't mean that every single thing is going to be absolutely perfect on day one. As has been reported, it's undoubtedly the case that some schools will provide a cold meal initially until their capital works are complete. And in the medium term, we expect all schools to be giving a hot food option, which is what is really necessary, after all, to meet the school food standards. And of course, many schools will be bringing in meals from outside caterers when the new service starts in September, rather than cooking them on site. That's something that happens at the moment, and many of these meals are excellent, and many schools will want to continue with that approach in the future. But let me be very clear that I know many schools are now raising their sights, and they want to bring back the on-site kitchens, which in some parts of the country were lost in the 1980s and 1990s. And some, quite a few, have already done this with the £150 million worth of capital funding that we announced last year in the autumn statement. Others, I know, will want to do it in the future after they have seen the policy implemented and seen how many parents are going to take up this offer. And I do commit today to you to looking very, very closely after September at what the government can do to support schools further in creating the right facilities and school environment to maximise the quality of food and the experience of eating that food. It would be unrealistic to think that in just 1 year we could completely rebuild and redesign the entire school estate and reverse decades of neglect in some areas of the country. But we are committing to support this policy not just to delivery in September, but over time to make sure that it is a success and can be built on. And I was not willing to allow the search for perfection to get in the way of delivering a step change in healthy eating which is needed right now in the country. So to the remaining very small number of schools who don't have a plan in place yet for September, our message is to work with your caterers and with the support service and with the department to ensure successful delivery. I'm doing everything I can to help resolve problems in individual schools. I signed off yesterday in the department on some additional amounts to help some schools around the country. And the support service can give practical help and show how other schools have risen to the challenge. One of the greatest things that I have seen recently, because it's exciting being involved in a policy like this in the department, and it's exciting reading all the papers, and it's fantastic every week when I get the delivery report from officials. It's the first thing I grab in the box to see how many red-rated schools there are and how much it's reduced. But you always find in government that the thing that really inspires you is when you're able to get out of the department and get out to the front line and find out what's really happening on the front line. And we had a wonderful experience a week or so ago in a school called Cheamfield School in Sutton. I think you might have seen something about it yesterday, maybe from Miles. And they had been in the media just a few months ago saying, we can't deliver this policy. Who on the earth thought this up? You know, what a terrible idea. It's impossible to deliver. It's impractical. And I think we put them in touch with the support service. You went in there, looked at options, gave advice. They worked with the local authority. They have put a pod in place. They had all the parents in there sampling the food. They had the children in there. They had a competition to name the kitchen pod. And they'd even invented, it sounds like a sort of Stalinist diktat from on high, but they'd even invented their own school song celebrating the introduction of school meals, which they sang to us like something out of the sort of Soviet Union that had been especially prepared for the arrival of the president or dictator. But it was wonderful. And that school had moved from being a rather grumpy, skeptical participant in the programme to an absolutely passionate advocate for delivering the policy, and not just delivering it and ticking a box, but delivering it in a really fantastic, high-quality way. And that's exactly what we want to see happen throughout the rest of the country. And that school, Cheamfield School, is a beacon for other schools that are worried about this, about what you can actually do if you set your mind to it. And it's also an exemplar of the type of work that the support service have done for us. So look, you're doing an outstanding job, and the numbers of schools that are now ready to deliver prove that. But of course there will be challenges along the way, and the support service is continuing to provide support and guidance in the lead up to September and right over the summer holiday period. And in fact, the support service will continue to be available until the end of next year to help schools as they move forwards on the journey towards delivering a really excellent, sustainable school meal service. Thanks to you, we are therefore on track to defeat the skeptics who said we'd never do this and who argued that it shouldn't be a priority. And I'm enormously grateful to those of you in the room for your hard work on this. I'm also grateful to head teachers and their teams up and down the country who are working tirelessly to make a success of this policy. And I know that as a consequence of the things we're doing in government, they've got quite a lot of other things that we're asking them to implement in September, as they tell me whenever I go into a school. So this is not the only thing that schools are having to do, but they are, I think, increasingly doing it not just as an exercise in something that they have to deliver, but with some passion. So it's a great privilege to be here today, to be able to speak at your conference, to be able to thank you for the work that you have done to make this a reality. I do believe that this policy is going to be a success, largely due to the work of all of you and of head teachers. And it's going to be, in my view, one of the real landmark social achievements of this coalition government. Good for attainment, good for health, great for British food, good for hard-working families. And one of the things that I think that we can be really proud that we've achieved, even in this parliament of austerity, when so much of what the government has had to do has been about balancing the books, cutting back, having to make economies. This is an area where we've taken a big, bold move to spend an awful lot of money to do something that we think is really important. So we will ignore the critics who want to snipe from the sidelines, and together we're going to deliver something of which all of us, I think, will be very, very proud, and which, in my view, will make this country a better place for young people to grow up in the future. Thank you very much indeed.